Millionaire lost his wallet. What these poor kids did next changed his life forever. Welcome, beautiful souls, to Emotions and Beyond, the place where hearts heal, stories breathe, and every tear tells a tale worth remembering. Before we dive into today's heart-shaking story, I want to ask you something simple but powerful. What would you do if two homeless children returned a millionaire's lost wallet, and inside it was a photo of their mother, who once was his wife? Stay with me, because this story will take you through the deepest valleys of pain, the cruel twist of betrayal, and the breathtaking rise of redemption. It's not just a story, it's a mirror to humanity, and a message our world needs right now. If you believe in love, in second chances, and in the power of truth, then you're exactly where you need to be. So, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and ring the bell so you never miss a single heartbeat we share here. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from right now? I love knowing how far these stories are traveling, because emotions, they have no borders. Now take a breath, hold it close, and let's begin, because Millionaire lost his wallet. What these poor kids did next changed his life forever is about to unfold. James Walker was the kind of man people watched from a distance, wondering how someone so young could possess so much charm, wealth, and authority. His name echoed in boardrooms, his smile graced magazine covers, and his journey from a struggling teen to a real estate tycoon inspired millions. At only 30, James had turned steel and concrete into an empire, yet his greatest treasure was not in stocks or skyscrapers. It was Emily, his secretary, a soft-spoken woman with ocean-blue eyes and a heart as vast. Their love story bloomed quietly in the spaces between meetings and coffee breaks, nurtured in whispers and shared glances, until it exploded into the spotlight with a wedding that melted even the coldest critics. Emily was no gold digger, as the tabloids hinted, but a woman who had seen James before he wore tailored suits, who fell for his soul before his fortune. Their vows weren't written for show, they were a promise, a fire forged in truth. The world watched with raised brows, but inside their luxurious mansion, love wasn't performed, it was lived. 9 months after their union, on a stormy autumn night, Emily gave birth to twin boys, and James held them with trembling hands, overcome by a love he never knew he was capable of. The moment he heard their cries, his entire world shifted from profit to purpose. Days turned into nights filled with baby giggles, soft lullabies from Emily's lips, and James humming melodies he never knew he remembered. The walls of their home were painted with warmth, with family dinners, bedtime stories, first steps, and sleepy cuddles under cashmere blankets. James would cancel meetings just to be there when the twins woke up, their tiny hands reaching for him with absolute trust. Emily, radiant in motherhood, glowed with a love that deepened daily. They weren't just a couple anymore, they were a family, a team of 4, sailing through life with the wind of happiness at their backs. Yet, behind the velvet curtains, danger stirred quietly. Jealousy lingered in the eyes of so-called friends who smiled too wide and whispered too often. Some couldn't digest James's success, others couldn't stand that he found love where they saw only power. Among them lurked people who thrived on cracks in perfection, ready to sow doubts with soft lies and cunning smiles. And though James felt invincible, he couldn't hear the whispers of envy slithering into his circle. In the boardroom, he was ruthless, but at home he was vulnerable. Emily was his heart, and the boys were his breath. There were moments when he'd sneak into the nursery just to watch his sons sleep, counting their breaths, fearing he might one day lose this fragile happiness. He often told Emily, "I've built a world out there, but you 3, you are the only thing that makes me feel alive." She would smile, resting her head on his chest, whispering, "Then promise me we'll never let anyone ruin this." And James, in his youth and arrogance, believed no one could, but he didn't see the shadows growing, didn't notice the way trust could be chipped away by a well-timed word, or how love could be questioned by those who called themselves friends. Their fairy tale was real, tender and glowing, but fairy tales, too, have enemies. For now, laughter filled their home, love tucked them in each night, and every morning felt like the start of forever. Yet as the sun set behind their mansion each evening, a storm silently gathered in the distance, waiting for its moment to strike. But as the storm brewed beyond the horizon, it finally found its moment in the form of a knock on the door late one evening when the golden light of James's perfect world was still flickering warmly inside. His oldest friend, Brian, a man he'd trusted since college, who'd stood beside him through failures and triumphs, entered with eyes clouded by something more than concern. James welcomed him without hesitation, offering a drink, unaware that the poison he was about to receive wouldn't be in the glass. Brian's words dropped like shards of ice. "James, there's something you need to hear, and it won't be easy," he began, his voice low, rehearsed. "It's about Emily. She's not who you think she is. I've seen her, meeting men in private, whispering over phone calls at odd hours, slipping into hotels when she claimed to be visiting her doctor." Each word dug deeper, slicing through the tapestry of trust James had wrapped his family in. He stared blankly, a rush of disbelief flushing his face, heart thudding louder with every accusation. He wanted to scream, to deny, to ask for proof. But anger clouded his reason, and doubt, once invited, spread like wildfire. Brian's deception was subtle, calculated, masked with concern. "I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't watch you be fooled anymore," he said, gripping James's shoulder like a brother. And James, blinded by pride and the sting of betrayal, swallowed the lie whole. That night, he stood outside Emily's room, watching her hum a lullaby to their boys, her smile tender, unaware of the storm rising just beyond the doorway. But James didn't ask her anything. He didn't confront her, didn't give her a chance to explain or defend. His silence became a weapon, his distance a punishment. The next morning, without even looking her in the eyes, he handed her divorce papers. "Leave," he said coldly, his voice stripped of emotion. Emily stood frozen, the papers trembling in her hands, her lips parting, but unable to form words. "James, why?" she whispered, her eyes pleading for understanding, but he turned his back before the tears began to fall. No explanation, no room for truth, just exile. And just like that, the woman who once danced in the glow of his love was forced into the street with nothing but her dignity and 2 infants. The gates of the mansion closed behind her with a finality that echoed louder than thunder. Emily wandered the city with trembling hands, holding her babies tight as wind bit through their thin clothes. She knocked on shelters, was turned away from clinics, curled up beneath bridges with her sons, tucked against her chest to shield them from the cold. Once known for her grace and elegance, she now walked in torn shoes, with hunger gnawing at her bones and shame pressed into her soul. People passed without seeing her, and the ones who did judged her with eyes that never cared to ask what brought her there. At night, she'd whisper lullabies through chattering teeth, praying her boys would never remember the hunger or fear, only her love. She sold her last piece of jewelry, a bracelet James once gave her, to buy milk. On days when food was scarce, she would lie and say she'd already eaten, just to watch her sons finish the last bite. Despite the pain, she never cursed James. She cried alone, quietly, in corners of the world where no one would hear. She still carried a photo of him in her tattered bag, not out of longing, but because she wanted the boys to know who their father was, even if he had abandoned them. She told them stories of his kindness, his strength, leaving out the part where he turned away without asking why. Her health began to falter, first fatigue, then coughing, then blood. She'd clutch her chest in the middle of the night, gasping silently, willing herself to hold on one more day, just to keep the boys safe. She didn't want pity. She wanted strength, but strength without support is a thread in the wind. James, meanwhile, returned to a house that echoed too much. The laughter was gone, the scent of baby powder and lullabies erased. Yet he buried his sadness beneath work, telling himself it was justice, never realizing he'd been manipulated by the very person who smiled at his downfall. Emily, now just another nameless face on the street, fought to keep dignity alive in a world that had already decided she didn't deserve it. And through it all, she loved her sons fiercely, deeply, fully, teaching them to be kind even when the world was cruel, and to hold on even when everything felt like it was falling apart. The city did not pause when Emily's strength began to vanish. Life moved on as she faded slowly beneath the weight of silent suffering. Her boys, now 6, had grown beside street lamps and soup kitchen lines, their laughter dimmed by hunger, but never by her love. Every morning she combed their hair with shaky hands, kissed their foreheads and told them stories that wrapped their world in warmth, though her body was freezing from the inside out. The blood she coughed into rags became a secret she buried beneath forced smiles, her pain masked by lullabies whispered under trembling breath. Clinics turned her away, prescriptions were paper dreams, and hospitals became monuments of unreachable hope. Her steps grew slower, her voice weaker, but her spirit, though battered, never let go. On cold nights, she pulled both boys into her embrace, wrapping herself around them like armor, whispering dreams she wouldn't live to see. One winter morning, with her breath thin and her skin pale as dawn, she led the boys by hand to a small clinic with shuttered doors and a faded cross. Her knees buckled, but she forced a smile, crouching to their level, holding their faces as if to memorize them. They didn't understand why her hands were colder than usual or why her eyes wouldn't stop watering even though she told them not to worry. She whispered, "You two are my entire world, my little lights." Her heartbeat slowed beneath her ribs like a fading drum. The boys clung to her, tears beginning to form as they begged her to sit, to rest, to go home, but there was no home anymore. The air turned still. Her breath caught one final time. And then, in the quiet space between their sobs and the honking of distant cars, her head rested against the clinic door, her arms limp, her soul free. The twins screamed her name, tugged at her sleeves, shook her shoulders, but she had already drifted into the silence she feared not for herself, but for them. Hours later, a kind old woman who had seen them begging in the neighborhood called for help. But it was too late. No hospital could revive a heart that broke long before it stopped. The city didn't mourn, no headlines marked her death. She was buried in a forgotten cemetery on the edge of town, the kind where wild grass choked the soil and nameless graves slept in rows. The boys stood there barefoot, clutching each other, as a simple wooden plank marked the resting place of the woman who had once been everything. No priest, no choir, no flowers, just a dull sky and 2 orphaned hearts breaking in unison. One of them placed a stone he had painted with her name on it, using colors he had begged for weeks earlier. "We love you, Mommy," they whispered, their voices trembling like the leaves that rustled around her grave. That night, they had no one to return to, nowhere to sleep. They wandered through alleys, curled beneath abandoned buses, and watched the stars from rooftops they weren't supposed to climb. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, but it was the emptiness beside them that hurt the most. They spoke to her in the dark, pretending she was still listening, asking her to come back, even if just for one more bedtime story. Days turned into weeks. They learned to steal glances of pity from strangers, to offer cleaned windshields for coins at traffic lights, to pretend they weren't afraid when men passed too close or nights grew too loud. And yet, through all of it, they held on to her final words like scripture. "Never hate your father. He once loved me. Deeply." The words burned and healed all at once. They didn't know what he looked like, only the blurry photo Emily used to show them before it was stolen one day at a shelter. But they remembered the way her voice softened when she spoke about him, even after everything. That was enough to keep hate from poisoning their heart. In their pockets, they carried a single item left behind, a torn piece of cloth from her dress. It was all they had of her, yet it felt like the whole world. Orphaned not by accident but by circumstance, they walked into a world that didn't want them, with nothing but each other and a love that refused to die. The morning sky was as dull as the boys' spirits, veiled in heavy clouds that matched the emptiness inside their small, frail bodies. With cracked feet resting on the cold pavement, they sat on a ragged cloth near the curb, arms wrapped around each other for warmth, their eyes too tired to even beg aloud anymore. People passed without notice, some with disgust, others with pity that never stopped to help. They weren't just hungry, they were fading, bit by bit, from the world's memory. And then came the purr of a luxury engine, foreign and almost surreal in their daily symphony of traffic noise and distant sirens. A sleek black car, polished like a mirror, pulled to a gentle stop not far from where they sat. The boys looked up, not with expectation, but instinctively, curiosity flickering faintly in their eyes. From the driver's seat stepped a man, tall, striking in presence, dressed in a dark coat and crisp shirt, his hair combed to perfection, his shoes clicking authoritatively against the sidewalk. He didn't look down, he didn't see them. He was on a call, distracted, his brow furrowed with the stress of deadlines and business deals. That man was James, wealth still clinging to every detail of his appearance, but not a trace of his past pain evident in his expression. As he spoke into his phone and reached into his coat pocket to retrieve a document, his leather wallet slipped quietly from his grasp, landing just inches from the boys with a soft, barely audible thud. Neither he nor his chauffeur noticed. He climbed back into the car a few moments later, still lost in conversation, and the vehicle vanished into the crowd of engines and horns. For a second, everything was still. One of the boys tilted his head, then cautiously crawled forward, his hand brushing the edge of the wallet. It was heavier than it looked, warm from the man's coat. They exchanged glances, confused, cautious, uncertain what to do. They had never held something so pristine, so valuable. It wasn't just about money, they could sense importance in its weight, in the way the leather didn't crack like their old clothes. Gently, they hid it beneath their worn blanket, not out of theft, but protection. A voice inside, maybe their mother's echo, reminded them to be careful with things that didn't belong to them. Meanwhile, blocks away, James stepped out of his car, approaching the glass doors of his towering office building. With practiced motion, he reached into his pocket to pull out his keycard, and froze. His hand met empty air. He patted his other pockets, confusion spreading into concern, then into dread. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to his assistant in panic. "Check the car, check everywhere." But as the seconds ticked and the card failed to materialize, a cold sweat broke along his brow. That wallet wasn't just an accessory, it was his life, bank access, ID, license, private business cards, and most of all, one irreplaceable item, the photo of Emily. Worn at the corners but protected always behind his ID, it was the only thing he had never removed, even after the bitterness of divorce. He carried it like a ghost he wasn't ready to bury. Now it was gone. His heartbeat accelerated, palms clammy as visions of identity theft and exposure spiraled in his mind. But somewhere deeper, beneath the business panic, a quieter fear crept in, of losing that final tether to a woman he had once loved so fiercely, a love he had never truly understood how to grieve. He turned on his heel and rushed back to the street, breath uneven, scanning every corner of the city like a man searching for oxygen. Traffic blurred around him, voices became noise. He ignored calls, emails, everything. All that mattered was that wallet, that photo, that memory, the past he had sealed in leather, now cracked open in a place he never imagined, just steps from the sons he didn't know, still breathed the same city air. James darted across the pavement, eyes scanning every face, every crack in the sidewalk, desperation clinging to his chest like a tightening chain. His polished shoes splashed through shallow puddles from the night's rain. Yet he didn't slow down, didn't care about stares from passers-by or the honking cars he narrowly avoided. His heart pounded not just from the urgency of the lost wallet, but from a strange, inexplicable pressure weighing down on him, as though something more than his belongings was slipping through his fingers. Then, just as he passed the very corner where his luxury car had stopped earlier, he heard it. A voice, small, fragile. "Sir, please wait." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a whisper in a thunderstorm. He froze, spinning toward the sound. There, no taller than his waist, stood two boys, barely clothed for the weather, dirt smudged across their faces, hair matted, eyes far too heavy for their age. One of them clutched something to his chest, something James instantly recognized: his wallet. Time stalled for a moment. Breath caught in his throat. "Is this yours?" the older boy asked, his voice careful, guarded, as if the truth depended on James's next word. James stepped forward, stunned. "Yes! Oh my God, yes! Where did you find it?" His voice cracked, the panic still vibrating under each word. But the boy didn't hand it over right away. Instead, with a seriousness that didn't belong to a 6-year-old, he said, "Then tell me something first. Who is this woman?" His small fingers opened the wallet, revealing the single photograph that had survived years of distance and regret. Emily's picture, tucked safely behind the ID card. James's breath hitched as his eyes locked onto her face. The years hadn't dulled her image. She stared back at him with the same gentle smile she wore the night he first kissed her beneath falling snow. He blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in his eyes. She was my wife," he whispered. "My love. My biggest mistake." The truth spilled out before he could stop it, the walls he had built cracking beneath the weight of memory. Silence settled for a beat, heavy and expectant. Then from beside the older boy, the younger one stepped forward, eyes glossy and wide. "Papa?" he said, voice shaking like a candle flame in wind. James looked down, startled. "What did you say?" But the boy wasn't looking at him anymore. His gaze was locked on the photo. That's our mum," he whispered, and a tear slipped down his cheek, carving a clean path through the dirt. The words hit James like a landslide, and he stumbled back, clutching his chest. The boys were staring at him, not with fear, not with awe, but with something raw, something ancient. Recognition. The older one slowly turned the wallet around again, showing James his own face on the ID next to the photo of the woman they had buried in silence. "Your name is James Walker?" he asked quietly. James nodded, breathless. "That's what she used to whisper when she cried at night," the younger said, and now both were crying, lips trembling, chests heaving. "She told us not to hate you," the elder added. "She said you once loved her. Deeply." The confession cracked James open. He dropped to his knees on the dirty sidewalk, face level with theirs, the city fading behind him. His hands shook as he reached out, hesitating, unsure if he even had the right to touch them. "My sons," he gasped, and the words felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he had long forgotten. But they didn't pull away. The older boy's face crumpled as he lunged forward, burying himself in James's chest, sobbing with all the pain he had kept bottled inside. The younger followed, wrapping his arms around his father like he was afraid to ever let go. Strangers slowed, watching the strange scene unfold. A man in a $1,000 coat kneeling on the street, cradling two homeless boys as if they were treasures he'd lost in another life. James held them tighter than he had held anything in years. His tears, hot and unchecked, fell into their hair as he whispered apologies he never thought he'd get to speak. I didn't know you were out here. I didn't know she—" But the boys didn't ask for explanations. They didn't demand reasons. They just clung to him, their little bodies shaking from emotion and cold, finally allowing themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone anymore. James's breath caught in his throat as their words echoed like thunder inside his hollow chest, and his knees, already weak, gave out fully beneath him, collapsing not just from physical shock, but from the unbearable gravity of realization crashing down like an avalanche. His arms tightened instinctively around the boys, but his soul was unraveling, every beat of his heart thudding with the ache of irretrievable time, of memories unlived, of lullabies unsung. What did you say?" he whispered again, his voice hoarse, his lips barely moving, but the boys didn't flinch. They just looked at him with wide, tear-drenched eyes that mirrored his own, their chests heaving as they choked on sobs that had waited far too long to be released. "She told us to never hate you," the elder repeated, his voice cracking as though it had to fight through layers of emotional debris. "She said you were good once. You made her laugh. She said you danced with her in the kitchen, even when there was no music." James's head dropped as if struck by an invisible force, and the picture he had buried so deep behind anger and betrayal began to claw its way back. Emily's smile, the warmth of her hands in his, the nights they stayed up planning baby names under the stars. His chest tightened as he whispered, I didn't know what I was doing when I let her go, when I didn't listen to her, when I believed someone else over the woman who carried my sons." He looked at them, his palms gently cradling their faces, and for a long moment his eyes simply searched theirs, as if trying to memorize every detail that had grown without him. The curve of their cheeks, the shape of their lips, the way they stared not with blame, but with longing. "You look like her," he murmured, voice shivering. "Both of you. You have her eyes, and her silence." They didn't speak, didn't need to, because the truth between them no longer needed translation. James's body trembled, as if shedding years of anger and guilt all at once, and his voice broke into something smaller, something raw. "She died thinking I hated her, didn't she?" The younger one nodded slowly, barely able to speak. "She cried every night, but she never said anything bad about you. Even when we asked why you left, she just said, 'He was lost.'" James clutched his chest as if trying to hold his shattered heart in place. "I destroyed everything," he said, more to himself than to them, "because I believed a friend instead of the woman I vowed to protect." His voice cracked like dry wood. "She died alone, and I was building empires." The boys looked down, one of them reaching into a worn satchel and pulling out a folded piece of fabric. It was a scarf, once white, now grey with age, and faintly scented with something floral. "This was hers," the younger said, placing it in James's hand. He held it like it was made of glass, tears spilling freely down his cheeks now, lips trembling with every breath. "Take me to her," he whispered, barely audible. "Please, I need to see her." The boys exchanged a glance, then nodded solemnly. One of them gently took James's hand, guiding him with quiet steps, past the noise of the street, past the blinking curiosity of strangers, toward a corner of the city where joy rarely visited. They walked through broken alleyways and cracked sidewalks, past forgotten walls painted with peeling dreams, and eventually stopped before a rusted gate guarding a cemetery that time had tried to erase. Weeds grew wild between crooked stones, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. The boys led him to a small, unmarked grave where the earth looked freshly disturbed, and a single flat stone lay atop it with no name, just a faded rose someone had left weeks ago. James dropped to his knees again, but this time not from shock, this time from reverence, from heartbreak, from an overwhelming sense of loss that no amount of money could ever mend. He reached out, touching the stone as if it could speak to him, as if her voice might rise from beneath the soil and tell him she forgave him. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely more than wind, "I failed you. I let lies poison what we had. I turned my back when I should have held you. I see you now. I see what I lost." The boys stood behind him in silence, their presence anchoring him in the moment, the only remaining proof of the love he once took for granted. James bowed his head, lips pressed to the scarf still clutched in his hand, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to grieve, not as a millionaire, not as a betrayed man, but as a father, a widower, and a soul trying to find its way back to a love that never really left. They stood in stillness before the silent grave, the cold wind brushing against their skin, as though the earth itself was trying to speak through the rustling grass that had grown unchecked around the forgotten stone, and James, no longer the invincible millionaire but a broken man desperate for healing, collapsed beside it, tears pouring down like unspoken years of regret. His hands dug gently into the soil, as if hoping to reach her, as if the earth might surrender her pain and pass it through his trembling fingers. "Emily," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw, "I failed you in every way a man can fail the woman he loves. I was blind, not just to the lies, but to your strength, your loyalty, your quiet suffering. I let anger drive me when love should have anchored me." The boys stood on either side, not moving, not interrupting, just holding his hands tightly, grounding him with their fragile presence. James placed a bouquet of soft red roses onto the grave, petals trembling in the breeze, and he closed his eyes as a single tear landed on the stone, baptizing it in remorse. "From now on," he said, his voice growing steady like a vow etched into time, "you will never be forgotten again. And they," he glanced down at the boys, "will never feel alone." The older twin leaned into his side, his small arm wrapping around James's, while the younger one knelt beside him, laying down a tiny handmade paper flower, one they had folded together during a cold night in the shelter. In that moment, surrounded by silence, sorrow, and second chances, something changed inside James, not the kind of change money brings, but the kind that breaks and rebuilds a soul. He stood slowly, still clutching their hands, and looked at the sky with eyes swollen from crying, but lit with newfound purpose. He didn't return to the city as a millionaire. He returned as a father. At home, the doors that once opened to emptiness now burst with laughter. Rooms that once echoed with business calls now rang with bedtime stories and toy-strewn chaos. James didn't just bring the boys home. He gave them their childhood back. He tucked them in each night, told them tales of their mother's strength, and framed her photo in every room so they'd never forget her face. And yet, the redemption didn't stop there. James redirected his wealth to something greater than profit. He founded the Emily Grace Foundation, a sanctuary for homeless mothers and children abandoned by society, offering them shelter, food, education, and a chance to rebuild what life had tried to steal. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was quiet, dignified, attended not by celebrities or cameras, but by women holding their babies close, tears glistening in the same way Emily's might have. In the foundation's lobby stood a statue, not of James, but of a woman kneeling with her arms wrapped around two children, her face carved with quiet dignity. The plaque read, "In memory of love lost and found again." News of the wallet spread like wildfire, turning what began as a moment of carelessness into a story of transformation. People everywhere talked not about the money James once had, but about the heart he found on a forgotten sidewalk, in the eyes of two starving children who gave back what they could have stolen, and in the memory of a woman whose name would now change lives. Schools used the story to teach integrity. Churches spoke of grace and forgiveness. Parents hugged their children tighter, and those with broken relationships found courage to reach out again. James, once worshipped for his success, was now loved for his humility. And every Sunday, without fail, he returned to that grave with his sons, now dressed in warmth and smiles, placing fresh roses and sitting in silence, letting the wind carry their words to where they hoped she could still hear. They spoke not of sorrow, but of progress, of new beginnings, of the lives they were touching in her honor. And though the world still rushed around them, that small grave became a sacred reminder that redemption is real, that forgiveness is possible, and that sometimes the most valuable thing a man can lose is what leads him to everything he was meant to find.